Welcome back to The Mature Male. I'm your host, Wes, a practicing psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Johnny Cole, founder and CEO of Hey Brother Co., a company dedicated to redefining masculinity and fostering healthy communities through men's work. Johnny is a marketing tech consultant who began his men's work journey at the University of Rochester, where he presided over men opposing violence everywhere, focusing on sexual assault prevention education. After completing gender studies coursework and working at the Willow Domestic Violence Center, Johnny realized his responsibility in reaching other men to unlearn patriarchy and improve social conditions for all. He pivoted to formal men's work practice and led Hey Brother Co.'s first men's retreat in July 2022. Through Hey Brother, Johnny empowers men and boys to embrace authenticity, process emotions, and become compassionate leaders in an inclusive movement that champions all marginalized communities. Johnny, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Brother, that was awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today.
Yeah, man. Super excited to dive in from one brother to another. So, your personal journey into this work is deeply rooted in your own experience with trauma and domestic violence, growing up with a father who was in the South African Special Forces. That's an incredibly difficult foundation, yet it led you to this transformative, meaningful work. Can you walk us through how those early experiences of surviving domestic violence really shaped your understanding of masculinity and ultimately drove you to create Hey Brother Co.?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for such a profound and hard hitting question to start off with. I was raised to be afraid of my dad and at the same time admire him tremendously because he represents a lot of what we are taught about manhood in our current society. We venerate soldiers, we venerate the warrior class. We believe that one of the pinnacles of manhood is a man capable of doing violence in support of a greater good, whether that is protecting his family, serving his country. And my dad had visceral experiences of violence. He was demonstrated proficient in it from his time in South African Special Forces. So from a very early age, he would tell me horror stories of what he had experienced, both as a way to impress upon me how hard his life had been, but also as a way to tell me there's nothing that I've been through or could ever go through to equate to that. That the true measure of masculinity and resilience was wartime. He would regularly speak about his initiation into manhood being at 19, going into the army and into the special forces, and compare that I had no such initiation and I could not hope to do the same thing. At the same time, he would never want me to go through that. But the push and pull there was that he gatekept masculinity and the idea of manhood from me by saying I couldn't go through what he had. But he also told me that it was horrible and that war and the military is this really traumatic experience. Now, in terms of the domestic violence aspect, I find that there are far too few men who open up about our experiences of survivorship and abuse. So given that my dad did physically hurt myself and my mom and my sister throughout my upbringing on different occasions, but the more omnipresent theme was just that what he says goes, and there was fear and intimidation used to structure our household. So I didn't ever have the words for it growing up, but I had a very dysregulated nervous system. And I had this really like push pull affection, admiration, and then fawn response to my father. I remember feeling from a very young age, maybe 5 or 6 was the first time I felt in my body. And I thought to myself, my dad doesn't like me, but I don't know. I was a very sensitive kid. I think naturally, as boys tend to be, a lot of the contemporary research shows that boys are much more sensitive than girls, especially male infants, cry more. And it's socialization that encourages us to toughen boys up. And I think because of my dad's own experience with violence, with wartime, with emotional toughness, with going to boarding school in South Africa, with a whole host of things, he had this predisposition to reject any sort of emotion and see the sensitivity that I had as a boy as somehow this is bad, as a failure as his father, and maybe even a reflection of a part of himself that he had long since tried to kill off and tried to separate from. And so it made him very uncomfortable. So it really colored my whole life because I grew up from boyhood thinking, well, my dad doesn't like me. It must be something about who I am. How can I change myself to get his approval and his acceptance? And what are the rules of manhood and masculinity? So it got me, to put a long story short, to where I am today because through adolescence and teenage years and eventually college, I went through a series of experiences that ended up ripping off this band-aid and this veneer that I had around idolizing my father. And I started to have this flood of memories come back that were suppressed because of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I realized that who he really was. And I made the decision to end our relationship and go no contact with him, which my mother and sister already had. And I started this journey of unlearning some of the things that were ingrained into me during my upbringing, which was the hardest thing that I've ever had to do in my whole life. And the last thing I'll close on with this synopsis is at first, especially in my earlier 20s, I felt very sorry for myself. And I thought that I had this unique story because who else have you ever met in your life whose dad was in the murder battalion in the Southwest African Territorial Force? You ever met anyone whose dad was in the murder battalion? No, right? So I was like, man, I got this really unique story. Woe is me. Man, like no one can understand me. I started to engage more vulnerably with some of the other men in college and some of the other men that I met after college. And I realized that while they didn't have the same upbringing, they experienced loneliness and loss and emotional disconnection. And they were living in the same patriarchal culture where they questioned, what does it mean to be a man? Am I man enough? They made decisions on how they present, walk, talk, dress, act to try to perform masculinity. And so in that, we have commonality. So I kind of got over that. And I realized like, I'm not as much of a special snowflake and my story's powerful and it's unique and interesting in some ways, but this collective wound we all have can be inflicted regardless of your unique circumstances. So now I'm on this mission to help men and boys self-actualize and understand that you can be whatever kind of man you want to be.
That's beautiful, man. Thank you for sharing. I know that even though you've obviously done a lot of the healing work, any sort of recall and recounting can bring things up. So I appreciate you offering that so generously to myself and the listeners. And, I said this when we were chatting before, but, I think just the fact that you are willing to share your story so honestly and like matter of fact, but not in like an apathetic or disassociated way, I think is encouraging to any guys listening out there. And as you were speaking, it sounded like there was some pretty key relationships in college, if I was picking that up correctly, that started to crack the shell a bit. And I'm curious if you could let us into those first few times or relationships where you started to talk about what you've been through with another guy, what that looked like. I think it's really important to learn some signals and how to do that because many guys maybe share, as you've said, not the same trauma, but certainly difficult things, and they're holding it to themselves. As we both know, self-reliance is a major fallacy that many men believe. So yeah, just curious if you could tell us more about that and how that was, what made you do it, would you do anything different?
Great question. I didn't actually open up to anybody about the violence in my home until I was 21 or 22. Throughout high school and then into college, I was bullied quite heavily by other boys, and I was bullied in my home by my dad. And so it really did impress upon me that there was something wrong with me and there was something uniquely different, whether it was getting the F slur written on my locker, getting pushed around, being cyberbullied, trying my best to play basketball and soccer and fit in with the cool athletic guys, but still being the butt of every joke and getting made fun of. It was really hard. But one thing was I did get along really well with girls, and I had some really close girlfriends, one of whom, not romantic, platonic friends, one of whom is still one of my best friends to this day, who trusted me enough to open up to me about their experiences with boys and with men behind closed doors. So I was privileged with this insider information of there are a lot of boys walking around at school that are some of the great athletes or really well liked or whatever, who, when they're alone with girls, have like forced their heads down to force them to, perform oral sex. And no one's doing anything about it. No one's talking about it. But I started to realize, well, this is somewhat similar to my experience, just in that I feel treated very differently by boys and men. And I see the different ways that we act in public with one another versus privately. And it mirrored my own experience being victimized by my dad, where in public, he was a very charismatic guy. He drove this huge, big Mercedes-Benz Unimog truck and built his own Land Cruiser with custom fitting. He's really into off-roading. So all of these other men, stopping at a gas station, hey, nice rig, can I take a picture? he got a lot of attention. And so it creates this really uncanny, like crazy feeling of, why do you treat me privately so badly when it seems like most of your interactions you're great, or you're charismatic or whatever. And I think that that's a lot of what women feel and girls feel, is like, why are you like this privately, but then publicly it switches. So a lot of times boys that would bully me on the soccer team or in public, if we ever were together just one-on-one, they would actually open up to me because I did represent just enough emotionality and sensitivity that they felt they could. And then when we were back in a public setting, they would act like we weren't as close and kind of distance themselves. That was their way of coping with our patriarchal, they just need someone to be the target, right? And so that's easier. So going into college, I still kind of had this wound and this like suspicion of men and this hypervigilance because I kept being mistreated. I've been shoved down fraternity steps because we don't let F slurs in here. I've been followed in pickup trucks by guys. I've been chased out of bars just because men get aggressive, and I've always styled myself in a certain way and presented in a certain way. My flower shirt and earrings, all these things, right? I repressed a ton of these memories of specifically my dad's abuse, but the stories kept mounting of girls and women would disclose to me their experiences. And the Me Too movement happened when I was in university. So it all came out as well, like how much is going on, how many survivors there are, and what men are doing, powerful men and regular everyday men. And I got to meet Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement. And I also kept having the experiences where young men in college who I hadn't spoken to in months, they lived in a fraternity house. We hadn't talked to maybe, since last year. We were freshman year roommates, and calls me up and says, "Hey, can you come over? I want to talk to you about something." And so I go to his frat house, the room that he's living in with supposedly all of his brothers, right? This whole house of like 30 guys, his brothers. And he closes and locks the door, and he starts opening up to me about his parents' divorce and his breakup. And I remember it at like 20 years old, maybe I was 21. I was so struck. I was like, "What are you talking about, man? Like the whole Greek life thing. I thought this was brotherhood. I thought I haven't spoken to you, and I didn't know you still want to be friends with me. And I'm the person you're calling on." And it's because I have always been this more emotionally open guy. To put a long story long, at the end of my college experience, I started an internship at this domestic violence center, and I started taking gender studies classes. And on the very first day of the internship, we had to go through and assess the power and control wheel. And we were told, what is domestic violence? Is it the stereotype that you know from movies, a black eye and a bottle of whiskey, or is it more complicated? And they had up on this projector with all the interns with this diagram, and they started talking about it. And I literally had crazy things just flashed before my eyes. All these memories came up when it was, financial abuse and economic abuse and using children and infrequent escalations to violence, but this overall like paradigm of fear and stress and anxiety that permeates households that are controlled by abusers. And I had to go take a step out into the bathroom. And so this was this really crazy, like come to Jesus moment for me, where I still didn't know how to talk about it. I'd never been in therapy before. And so, yeah, I didn't speak to any other men. I felt embarrassed for the first few years as well to admit that my dad, because he's another man, had hurt me, because it feels feminizing to say, well, another man beat me up or pushed me down or used to put me in an arm bar to get me to stop crying, because that made me in a position of submissiveness, which under our codes of masculinity, like, what do you mean you didn't fight back? You let another, so even though it's complete bullshit and I was a child for a lot of it, I was so wrapped up in fear and admitting this. So yeah, it wasn't until a few years later of therapy and really opening up that I started to be able to talk about this so freely. So would I do anything differently? No, I have no judgment on my former self, because I was just doing the exact best that I could with undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder. I have incredible compassion for that young man. But what I would advise to listeners, anyone who resonates with the experience of going through some sort of trauma, is do find a safe person. If you don't have any safe people, try to find an online resource, like a text crisis line, like a text line, just so that you can get in the habit of telling someone, even if it's writing it out in a text message or in an online portal. Find a therapist, or just find one trusted friend and say, "Hey, I need to open up to you about something. It's going to be really hard for me to talk about. Can you please just listen to me? I may not even be able to look at you and make eye contact, but can you just be in the room and listen to what I have to say?" And that would be my recommendation on. Well, I got a little tears coming up for me right now.
Hey man, yeah, take your time. A few things struck me while you were talking. I think the first is that you grew up in Ohio. I grew up in the South. I think the Midwest and the South are particularly a little bit more traditionally masculine. Now I live in Boston. I'm sure, done enough traveling to know that most big cities and the suburbs around them tend to, I think, present day be a little bit different, both in the types of dads that are raising boys now, but two, just the awareness and understanding of patriarchy and the shifting in dynamics. But all that said, I resonate with some of those things where, there was times it was definitely like inappropriate what some guys were doing at school. And it sounds like you carried the same. I was just like scared to tell somebody because at the end of the day, when you're a kid, belonging and like connection is everything. So you're like, I will let someone like beat the shit out of me every day if it means like I can kind of fit in. Not fully, obviously, like you learn to stand up for yourself a bit, but because you don't have a strong sense of self awareness and identity at that developmental stage in life, you almost have to succumb to that dominance hierarchy. But something I resonate with you in too is that I'm also wearing a flower shirt. And it seems like we're both more creative guys. And not to oversimplify it, but I think people that tend to be higher in creativity are tend to be higher in openness, tend to be more emotionally sensitive and in tune with that, and tend to not see life in this like black and white, good or bad. But also, when you're more creative, it moves the hierarchy from like here's me, here's you to this like collaborative, like horizontal type of thinking, right? So it seems like you're like this too, just more open to wanting to understand people, be there for people, have empathy. And I think many men really struggle with accepting that that is just as manly as like lifting 450 pounds and playing football. And I think those stereotypes are changing. But you're right. Unfortunately, that stereotype comes with a level of not just assertiveness, but what you're getting at, which is inappropriate and aggression that then creates tyrants. And then only one type of person dominates. And then it becomes this like reward penalty system, right? And if you're a boy that healthily expresses his emotions and is more sensitive and caring and there for people and doesn't perpetuate the violence, you get penalized. And if you're someone that does the opposite, you get rewarded. And I think that's an opportunity I think we have in the subsequent generations, which in a bit I'd love to hear with your work and understanding of these younger generations, like where they're at with it. But all that said, man, I appreciate you sharing. And for, you and I, it was like reflective work that we've had to do, but hopefully for the young men coming up, it can be active. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing that really struck me in what you were saying is how there was these guys that would come to you that you would think like never in a million years would they come. And I think it just points to the fact that men are so good about looking a certain way on the outside, and society is so good about trusting however someone looks on the outside because we're not comfortable actually having real conversations, asking how people are doing, checking in. We still live by this weird code where someone says, how are you doing? I'm good. Like it's just a weird thing where we almost are conditioned to stay that way. And I think it's ironic because the very thing that you got bullied for then later on became the very thing that became your superpower in a sense that drew men to you, that they in due time and maturity like realized that like, hey, this is the type of person I want to open up to, which we know psychologically we usually seek out that in a way that we hope we can become that. But because we can't become that right away, we almost need it modeled and we need to be exposed to it. And then you, I imagine, held space and talked to him, and that normalized something for him now that, I mean, I don't know, we're not going to call him now, but I'm sure if you talk to him, he would say like, man, I'm so thankful Johnny was there for me. Like that really changed my view of like opening up, and it really helped me process some things. And if we can just continue to make that the norm, essentially like what's hidden and secretive the norm, and what is very like outwardly and externalized like the aggression, the abnormality, I think we're heading in a good direction.
Absolutely. I'll touch upon that. Then I'll talk about what you initially said about boys kind of following the rules and being scared of, and the creativity aspect and hierarchy versus horizontal. And I'll segue that into one of the most transformative things, which was taking gender studies classes so that I can understand what feminism really is and how that removed a ton of this hierarchical thinking for me. And then we can segue into the high school program that I have now, and I think what young men are dealing with. First and foremost, my only change to what you said about men opening up, what I took from that growing up is not that, wow, this man never in a million years would I think he would open up. It's more so, I knew it. I knew it all along that there is nothing wrong with expressing yourself, that all of us have this capacity, that you're just as sensitive as me. I knew it. You're just better at hiding it. And so there was so much grief for me, like so much grief in losing these friendships and feeling a big sense of betrayal around boys and men who would treat me like this, where they would use me for emotional labor that they themselves could not reciprocate. Them doing that and opening up to me showed me what their hearts were like, and that they do crave connection just as much as I do. And it is something that I can offer. And then the betrayal and the grief came in. So why is the pull of being mean or bullying or teasing or adhering to whatever everyone else is doing? Why is that stronger than what I have to offer when it feels that you have been so vulnerable with me and that there's something sacred there? So that grief, I mean, really stuck with me, and it made me question my worth and my value, because I'm just like, man, like I know some things about a lot of boys, what boys are going through in high school, a lot of what men are going through in college, and yet, like, when do I get my turn to open up, and when is someone going to stand up for me? One of these guys that's, So to that I say, boys and men are just as naturally sensitive and emotionally capable and skilled and all capable. We just aren't as skilled because of conditioning, but that skill can be built up, and we do not credit boys and men enough with our actual capacity for love and openness when the environment is right, when the space is given, when the right person is present to allow for vulnerability or to go first and demonstrate emotional leadership. Men and boys will always, always amaze you. Now, in terms of creative or sensitive people being more inclined to see things horizontally, I need to process that a little bit and see, kind of, do I agree? How do I feel? But what I'll say is that the patriarchal value system tells us that there is hierarchy. At the top of the hierarchy is, someone who represents a set of qualities. You're big and strong, you're dominating, or maybe you're rich and successful, whatever it is. And as long as you can make sure someone else is lower than you, then at least you're not at the bottom. And at the bottom is women and gay men. And for the longest time, I tried to have the inputs to get to the top. The top is unattainable. Patriarchy is a literal pyramid scheme, because if Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who is so rich and successful and big and jacked, walks into the room with, what is his name? The guy that played the Mountain in Game of Thrones, that dude is bigger and stronger than Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. He might not be as rich, but if, depending on what contest you're measuring for, that the Mountain is more masculine, more manly, right? Is stronger. So who dominates who, right? It's a never ending quest. And so that's the pyramid scheme. The lie of patriarchy is you can actually never be at the top. So you exhaust yourself just trying to climb this ladder or whatever. But I tried. I wasn't super athletic in high school, but I tried to play soccer for several years. And by college, I started riding motorcycles. I played rugby. I got big and strong. I'm 6'4", and I was around then. I was 200 pounds. I'm now 225 pounds. I started to develop musculature, to work out more naturally. So I had a lot of these inputs of what people consider masculine, and it felt like it was never enough, because I was still emotionally lacking. Like I had emotional, I wasn't being supported by other men. I was like, I don't feel validated. I don't feel like enough. I still feel so insecure or vigilant around my relationships with other guys. So it's like, doesn't matter how many fights I got into, trying to pledge a frat, doing all these things. It never made me feel whole. So the thing that flipped this switch for me and was like, oh my God, everything I've ever been taught is a lie, right? On top of the internship, which made me realize my dad is not who I thought he was. He's not this hero. He's actually a bad man that has really hurt myself and my mom, and my sister. And a lot of what I was doing in life to try to be tough and strong and get fights with other guys and prove myself, a lot of that was based on his life view, and it's actually not mine. So who the hell am I? That was one thing, but it was taking gender studies coursework that really turned things around for me. Understanding that it's not about my personal inadequacy or insufficiency. There's nothing defective about me. There is just a social value system called patriarchy that we're all ingrained into, men, women, children, everyone. And we're all capable of contributing to that value system and maintaining it, maintaining the status quo. So boys and girls are taught, don't throw like a girl, boys don't cry, boys don't wear pink. And we all internalize that messaging in different ways. So there are plenty of women out there that say, boys don't cry. Come on, be a big boy, man up. Right? There are plenty of women that are homophobic and misogynistic. They are perpetuating patriarchal values. So it's not that capital P patriarchy means all men are bad and there's a small group of men deciding everything on how society is going to be. What it means is there's been this value system that's interwoven in the fabric of our society. And until you understand that and choose to go against it and are brave enough to suffer the consequences and still persevere, you are complicit. And there are different levels of both complicity and participation and then enforcement. Patriarchy is a system of policing, just as you mentioned. The feminist scholar Bell Hooks famously quotes that it is the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of men is not violence against women. It is emotional self-mutilation. It is violence against ourselves. And if a boy or man is unsuccessful in killing off the emotional parts of themselves, he can rely on other patriarchal men and boys to do that for him through rituals of shame and humiliation. It was reading books like that, Bell Hooks' The Will to Change, for the first time, that puts language and context to everything that I've experienced. To other boys, teasing me or whatever, it's a humiliation ritual to get me to toe the line, to get me to follow the rules. And the rules are fucking bullshit. And it's so frustrating because most of us at various levels are still playing by the rules in some ways. And it's a lifelong process to unlearn. But that value system and understanding and taking these courses and starting to familiarize myself and say, oh, it's not about me. It's not as personal as all that. It really is this value system that helped me create some distance, but it also helps me understand what are young men going through. And it helps me feel way less resentful of my high school bullies and experiences, and even personally, like of my father, because I understand, hey, it's all our first time living. We're all part of the same value structure. And there are so few examples of men who are willing to speak out against the system and then go the extra mile and mentor young boys and demonstrate it and model it and encourage it and be vocal. So if none of us have enough examples of how to do it, then how the hell are we supposed to break the rules? So I'm not angry anymore or judgmental. There's still some wounds that flare up occasionally, as you know, being a therapist, but like for the most part, it's been a tremendous healing journey to understand these things and these concepts. And that is what led me to start the high school boyhood program that I now lead.
Man, that's awesome. Thank you for breaking that down for us and sharing your experience in that framework. And I'm curious because the word feminism and patriarchy are such hot button topics. What would you say are some key misconceptions you see men holding on to in both of those words? And how do you address the resistance that comes up with them?
Great question. The first misconception around the word patriarchy is that it refers to a small group of men that are deciding everything for society, and the problems in society and throughout history are all the fault of men. And patriarchy means you as an individual man are responsible for everything that's ever happened that's bad. And patriarchy means fathers decide everything. And this is why a lot of men don't believe in patriarchy, because a lot of men do not have the experience of a father deciding everything for them. A lot of men do not see themselves as empowered decision makers who are dictating things. A lot of men feel very disempowered by our current society. A lot of men feel very victimized, don't feel like they have a lot of agency. And so what the hell are you talking about? A patriarchal system that supposedly gives me male privilege? What privileges? There's no trade school anymore. Houses are too expensive. I can't get a union job. College is too expensive. It's hard to get into. What the hell are you talking about? Men die all the time from suicide. What male privilege? So that's a big misconception. Patriarchy does not mean any of those things. Patriarchy really is just referring to that value system that I referenced earlier, where if you at some point in your life have heard things like you being raised in the South and me being a son of South African immigrants raised in Ohio have both heard some of the exact same phrases in our communities. Don't throw like a girl, man up, don't be gay, don't be, F-slur, all of that. That tells us that there is a certain common value system that is shared across our society, even though we have geographic differences, class differences, other things, right? So that's what patriarchy is. It's just talking about some of these quote unquote rules that we all believe are just normal and are somehow prescribed. So that's it. That's what patriarchy is. The second misconception around the word feminism is that feminism means women are better than men and men need to be taken down a couple pegs in order for women to advance. And feminism is man-hating. Feminism is the pursuit of equality in all forms. And with the advent of social media and algorithms, there are unfortunately a lot of young men and boys and news headlines and things like that. There are unfortunately a lot of young men and boys who are seeing feminism fed to them through a very specific view where it is women or people who are angry at the state of the world are angry at the scale of violence and abuse and environmental degradation. And they're talking about patriarchy being responsible, or they're talking about how much harm men do. And they identify, and then they'll say, I'm a feminist. And so men and boys will be like, oh my God, feminists are trying to blame me for everything. Feminists hate men. And there are videos of women saying, I hate all men. I don't care about men's mental health. So I understand that. It's not the majority of feminists whatsoever. Feminism is just about the pursuit of equality. So feminism is the pursuit of equality, racial justice, social justice, gender equality, advocating for any survivors of abuse in any capacity, no matter their gender. And that's all it is. So if anyone is ever saying that they are a feminist, but their feminism has some caveats to it, and they're saying, well, I think that women, for example, in Susan B. Anthony, famous suffragette Susan B. Anthony, she was pretty stoked on getting white women's ability to vote, right? So if your feminism has some caveats, that's not really feminism. It's not what it is. Or if you're like, I think that men should express themselves. Of course, I want men to be more emotional, right? Oh, down with the patriarchy. I want more men to be emotional. But as soon as I encounter emotional men, it makes me very uncomfortable. And I say, ugh, ick. It's not feminism. You're perpetuating the patriarchal value system, right? So those are some of the common misconceptions that I see. The best book recommendation that I have that is available as a free audiobook chapter by chapter on YouTube is Bell Hook's The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love. And it, for some people, might be a little bit heavier, but genuinely it is the most amazing, foundational text. And it's powerful because it was written by a woman. And so it really showed me that, man, there are so many women out there that really do care about my well-being as a man and do not want me to continue to be harmed by this cycle. So, yeah.
Yeah, Johnny, thank you for sharing those reframes. And I think it's really encouraging, and we'll make sure to put that book in the show notes. And I think for any guy listening, just as much as you have felt pain and resistance because you were judged or because things were assumed about you, don't return the favor and really let people speak for themselves, but use this framework as a helpful guide to know where to place people in proper definitions. So I think that was really helpful. Johnny, you mentioned a little bit ago about this mentorship program. So you actually run one at your former high school, where you work directly with Gen Z and Alpha generation boys. Curious what you are seeing as the primary issues and challenges that these young men are facing that are different from previous generations. And then from there, I'd like to touch on social media isolation and cultural climate. But yeah, let's start there.
Yeah. I started the Oberlin High School Men's Work Project 2 years ago. Will be our third year with my ninth grade English teacher, David Reese. I was in town and we happened to see each other at the local restaurant and bar because Oberlin's a very small town. And he's like, oh my God, Johnny Cole? I went by John back then, John Cole. And he barely recognized me because I looked very different than in high school than I do now at 27. And we caught up and I told him all about my life story, the men's work I'd been doing, my traumas, all these things that no one ever knew about me. We kept it very private, what was going on in our household. No one ever knew about things like my sister's suicide attempts, what was going on, what my dad was doing. Nobody knew what, they just thought I was a really moody kid. And at times also a very, he's fine because he's doing really well academically and he's, really positive and upbeat and kind. So he must be great, but so he's learning all this stuff about me for the first time. And he's like, oh my God, what? So I'm telling him about the men's work and my journey to that point. And he said, this is the exact type of thing that we need at the high school. We need boys talking about this stuff because my daughter is 15 now. She's in her sophomore year and she's getting catcalls in the hallway. She's getting bullied in these ways. Boys are talking about body count and, hoes or XYZ and, just there's nothing that exists. And there's a program for the girls, a mentorship program called Rocks, Ruling Our Experiences. There's no program for the boys. The only time they ever tried to start a program for the boys, it was a remedial program for just all of the bad kids. And as soon as you have a healthy manhood program or mentorship program that only gets together all of the worst boys, they're going to get in that room, look around and say, oh, this is what you think of me. This isn't about healthy manhood. This is, you think I'm wrong and you're trying to fix me. Over this dinner, we ended up, it was hours. Then we went to his house and we were like, we need this program. Well, let's start something. Let's talk about this. And we ended up asking his teenage daughter, because it's such a small community. We were like, who are some of the guys that should be in this program? Here's our criteria. We want some of the sensitive boys that might be bullied out of their sensitivity if there's no peer support and corrective action. We want some of the popular guys that have social capital. Maybe they're athletes, maybe they're just like great dudes, boys that other guys will listen to. We want a couple of the guys that are making these bad comments that are actually the offenders and, who need this. And we want a couple of the, just like kids of make sure we're not just kids that are in advanced classes or just intermediate classes. We want everyone, right? So we design, she gives us some names, and we end up deciding on this list of 24 students for the first year, which represents about 20% of the male population in the whole school because it's such a small community. So anyway, we started the program, and it was amazing. And it's been a few years of just like so much wonder, because it's been one of the greatest gifts of my whole life, because not only did I get to go back into my own high school environment, which was so turbulent and traumatic for me, and now I have had a corrective experience there. It's a therapy term, but I've reframed for myself reassociated for myself this entire experience. And I've been able to provide boys with the support that they need to have peer conversations and to have it modeled for them, healthy masculinity, in a way that I desperately needed. I would have loved this program when I was in school, because what we do is we get boys together and we start by asking this question, like, where did you learn what it means to be a man? Let's talk about what this man box thing is. What are some examples of what we'd say about manhood? And how does homophobia impact your friendships? When people say like no homo, or when what Gen Z guys say, one of the slang terms is like glazing, which means you're, glazing or meat riding. Like, bro, I don't mean to glaze, but that's a good fit. Like, bro, I don't mean to glaze, but like you played well at the last game, right? So it's this idea that like, I don't, it's referring to like oral sex, right? Like, I don't mean to like suck you off or blow smoke up your ass, or I don't want to be like, whatever, but here's a compliment. And so we'll have entire sessions just based off of that one premise of like, hey, let's talk about this term, glazing. What does this mean? Like, I know it's just jokes, but like, what does this actually mean? And boys will end up like, man, again, just amazing you, where I say like, what are some of the things that we do consider sus or zesty, which is another way of saying gay? And one boy, like, silence. And then in the room, one boy will be like, anything. And he says it so indignantly, and he's frustrated. He's like, anything. And I'm like, tell me more. He's like, it doesn't matter. It's not consistent, because some days it's like, complimenting another guy. Some days it's what you're wearing. Some days it's not, it's not consistent, because the things that we say are gay, and the homophobia that's normalized is not based in reality. It's this construct of like, these manhood rules. So I think I deviated a little bit from your question, but what informed the entire curriculum for my program is the research from a nonprofit called Equimundo. Equimundo partners with the Global Boyhood Initiative to produce reports on men and boys. They release reports called the State of American Men Report. They just released the 2025 report this past June. And then previously they had the 2023 report. In the 2023 State of American Men Report, they surveyed over 2,000 men and boys aged 18 and up around the United States that are demographically representative of our country. And they asked them a bunch of different questions about their lives, about political views, about manhood, about mental health, all of these things. And there's some crazy data in both of these reports. One of the highlights is that 66% of men ages 18 to 23 feel that nobody really knows them. So 2/3 of young men, college aged, feel that nobody really knows them. That is insane. And the Global Boyhood Initiative has the State of American Boys report, which has some data highlights and says, what percentage of boys are hearing the phrase man up? What percentage of boys feel that they can go to a trusted adult to talk about their feelings? What percentage of boys agree with the phrase, emotional expression is weakness? And that also has some really amazing summative data on what are the different realms where boys learn about boyhood, right? In the home, at school, in media, in sports, and what are some of the ways that at each of these realms, whether if you're a parent or if you're an educator or if you're a coach or wherever you situate, what are some of the things that we need to be observant about in order to help boys preserve their emotional selves and not adhere to these rigid standards of masculinity? So this amazing data, this amazing research got me thinking. It's how I design all of my curriculums for Hey Brother Co men's groups and for men's retreats. It's based on like, what are we seeing in the world? What are the main problems, and how are men saying they're struggling? How are boys saying they're struggling? So specifically with that data point around feeling like no one really knows you, that's not saying 2/3 of all young men have no friends and never hang out with anyone or don't have any family members, right? there are so many men and boys walking around that regularly go to the football game together. They tailgate, or they go to the bar. They're out with people. They're hanging. They have brothers and sisters, and they're hanging with going fishing with their dad. Despite all of that time they spend with other people, they do not feel known, which speaks to this incredible emotional lack and emotional disconnect that men feel. And to feel known, you must cultivate trust. And to create trust, you need to demonstrate vulnerability. And the depth of a connection equals, it's an equation. Depth of connection, which we can say is maybe like feeling known and feeling connected with someone. Depth of connection equals vulnerability over time. So if you have a really vulnerable person that trauma dumps on you, and I just met you, like this podcast, and you're like, oh, wow, like that, we don't necessarily have the deepest connection. We're starting to get there, but we haven't known each other that long. Or if you have a couple of mates that you've known since grade school, but you guys have only ever kept it surface level, and you only ever open up to each other when you're drinking at the bar, but somehow those are your best friends who you're going to rely on to speak at your wedding and be your best men. Well, that's not a very deep connection there. And I would say most men fall into that category. It's like, no, I've known these guys forever. These are my college buddies. These are my whatever. But there's not a lot of vulnerability that's ever been expressed. So the depth of connection is low. So that is how I founded the program. Some of the considerations I made when designing the curriculum in order to support boys in the ways that evidence shows boys need to be supported. And it has been a really beautiful gift to the community. And we've seen really amazing outcomes in not just measured in the results, like we take surveys from the boys, and we're doing a scientific university institutional review board backed study this year on this year's cohort, where we will ask boys 3 different surveys and their parents at 3 different points in the year. It's going to be really cool. But anecdotally, a lot of the administrators and teachers have said, whoa, we have boys like giving each other affirmations before basketball, like, Carmelo, you are loved, you are worthy, you are a good friend. We have boys hugging in the hallway, right, where they used to just dap up and nice to see you. We have boys that are not participating or are in catcalling and stuff, and boys that are telling other boys, hey, don't say that, man. And I've got 15 and 16-year-old boys that could tell you what the rape culture pyramid is and why catcalling or watching porn and locker room talk contributes all the way up to violence against women. So it's pretty freaking cool. It may be one of the most important things I've ever done in my life.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that and giving us such profound insight into the program, how boys that age operate, the language they use, the study, which from Ecomundo, which we will also put in the show notes, and then just your testimonies of sharing the change. And, it sounds like because of the social media, that feeling of isolation and just like the current cultural climate that is so polarizing, it makes it like no one feels safe talking to someone else because you don't know like where they're coming from, what they believe. And instead of just being healthily secure and opening yourself up to give someone a chance to hear your story and for you to share and to set the tone, we internalize it and we just say, well, like you said, probably no one cares. What's the point of sharing it? All these things, even though they have people around them, that depth starts there. And the testimony I'm taking from that here is that it only takes a few guys that really believe it, like at their core, like their true conviction is to believe it to the point of acting it out, that slowly has a ripple effect. And those one-off comments about not saying that to a girl or affirming a fellow guy or giving a hug, like in that moment, it's like, it's just one action, but the ripple effect starts to change the ethos and the way men engage. And then now you start seeing the norm turning from bullying and that patriarchal hierarchy into, this radical equality that's full of love and connection. And yeah, I just think there's so many different approaches there, and I'm thankful for yours.
Thanks. Yeah. Let's talk about social media. One second, one more thing to say about it is that the reason why this program is so effective is because a lot of teenage boys right now feel that they're being told how to fix themselves, that boys are just defective girls, boys are would-be predators, and we need some sort of intervention program. Masculinity is toxic. Like, boys are like, people need to be different. And I'm hearing from adults and from my mom, or maybe from some men, that men need to express themselves more, but they don't have any men your and my age who are modeling that for them. So a lot of teenage boys they know, they're like, oh, technically it's okay to cry, I guess, but they've never seen an adult man do that. So we're expecting them to be the first. And we've got adult teachers, administrators, and coaches that football coach, that's actually one of the most frequent places where that boy is getting called you know, it's from his coach. It's from an adult man who has never done his own work and has never processed that that's not okay, an okay way. Yeah, sure, some of the teachers are, progressive, or they're kind, or they'll say it's okay to cry. But again, these are men who have never done men's work. They also don't understand feminism or patriarchy or whatever. And so they are not modeling like closeness or vulnerability or emotionality. So my co-facilitator, David, and I, we hug to greet one another. We have cried in session with high school boys. I have disclosed to them some of my appropriate in an appropriate fashion, some of my experiences when I was literally in their shoes in the same building. And it's really powerful to model that and set the precedent of emotional leadership. And then boys trust you more, and they say, oh, okay, well, I still respect this guy, and he just opened up to me. And it's a really powerful exercise to ask, like, what's the cost of opening up to someone? Some boys will be like, well, they'll use it against you. They'll think you're weak. They'll whatever. And then I'll go, all right, do I have your permission to share something really vulnerable? And I'll look around, all the boys a bit cool. And I'll tell them a story. Maybe it's my sister's suicide attempt, or, something specific about my dad, or a bullying experience. And then I'll pause and I'll say, all right, now who here in this room has more respect for me because I told you this about myself? Everyone raised their hand. I'm like, now who in this room is going to use this against me or thinks less of me because of it? No, not a single hand goes up. And then it's in real time. I've just like gotcha them, Socratic method style. Like, yeah, dude, like, look, the worst thing you thought would happen, not a single one of you actually follows through with that. But you're completely correct that social media is a huge problem area right now of some pretty terrible values. And yeah, there's a whole grab bag of social media. So I'll pause here and like, what are your thoughts or questions around that?
Yeah, man. No, I appreciate you sharing that story with the boys. I think, yeah, that's right. I think modeling it, you know, when you're younger, and you mentioned this at the start, actually, something you said pretty profound that most men don't realize, but when you're younger, whether or not you want to revere or idolize your dad, you do. And unfortunately, that means that if he's a shitty version and less than ideal, that's what you'll idolize, and that's what you'll value, that you feel indebted to the point where many men will reenact that in their own way as they grow up, even though they know deep down something's wrong. And I think the way that we change that is by remodeling a different approach in a way that lets boys know, hey, there are grown men who don't just act like my dad, my football coach, all these things. And you maybe don't have the relationship with those coaches to directly say something yet, right? That's obviously the goal, to eventually get there. They might not have anyone in their life telling them, but you sure as hell can give them a different approach and a different way of seeing things. And it speaks for itself, right? Because when they see this grown man like you being secure in who he is, being aware and being vulnerable, but as a man and in a healthy way, and like you said, Socratically showing them, like, it breaks down really quickly this fallacy that if I open up, it means I'm weak, or that I'm gonna be disconnected. So yeah, no, I just wanted to say that. And then shifting gears slightly, though I do appreciate like the insight in social media. You mentioned, a lot of men don't do men's work. So I would like to touch on the men's work space. You're obviously in it. I am. There are many different approaches, from the traditional masculine archetypes to therapeutic models to spiritual practices. And you've seen it all through your work. So what do you think are the most effective approaches for different types of men? And how do you help a guy figure out like which path may serve him best, and the potential pitfalls of some of the more popular approaches you've observed?
Great question. My definition of men's work is any organized activity for men to focus on self-development and becoming better men. Kind of simple. That's men's work. Anytime men get together and say, I want to be better, and I want to work together on this, that's men's work. Men's work can just be a hard conversation with a close friend where you talk about your divorce. Men's work can be starting to kiss and cuddle your family members a little bit more, even though there's something uncomfortable for you about some physical affection. Men's work can be, um, you know, choosing to show up at every soccer practice for your kid because you never had someone do that, or deliberately saying, I'm not going to yell as much or whatever. Like, all of these things are men's work. These are some examples. So that's my definition of men's work. There are a lot of different approaches to this practice. When I was first out of college, I did not know what men's work was because it's not yet quite a mainstream and standardized industry or anything like that. And so I can't remember how, whether it was through social media or Googling, but like I found out about men's work. And maybe it was a therapist recommended the Mankind Project to me. And I found a virtual chapter that was local to me in North Carolina. And I joined it and zoomed in for a few sessions. I was 22 or 23 at the time. And I immediately noticed that I was the youngest person there by about 10 years or more. And then through the first few sessions, they began to describe some of the mythopoetic men's movement masculine archetypes: the warrior, the king, the magician, the lover. And I did not really resonate with that language. And even candidly, the name of the podcast, like The Mature Male, there was a time in my life where my dad, again, was trying to gatekeep and use these language of like initiation rituals to gatekeep manhood and masculinity from me. And so any language around becoming the mature or the grounded or the king masculine or whatever made me personally feel like you're telling me I'm not good enough and that there's something wrong with me. And this is just the same thing that a lot of other men, including my dad, have told me my whole life. And so I wasn't ready for that. And I was like, okay, I see that there are some men in this virtual space that are crying and opening up and experiencing some catharsis. So this is great. I'm happy for them. But I'm on my high horse, fresh out of gender studies classes, and I'm kind of a little upset that no one has said the word patriarchy and this value system. And instead, we're, doing a 2-hour session on how to tell if you're in your magician, And I'm like, damn it, like, come on, man. So anyway, that's a personal story. Is just say like that's why I started Hey Brother Co. and why I started my own men's work practice, is because I just didn't see there to be any men's work organizations out there that really specifically catered to men of my generation. I was born in 1997, and my assessment of the current state of men's work is that so many of them really struggle to appeal to men under the age of 25, basically. And most men's path to men's work is in their 30s or 40s after some sort of hard thing, like some loss, some breakup, divorce, estrangement from children, a mental health crisis. Like there's some sort of addiction, job loss, like something happens, and then you're like, oh, I got to get my shit together. And then you start your process later in life. But it's the way that they're structured is, in my opinion, is not necessarily like accessible and amenable to men of younger generation. So the different types of men's work that are out there, right? I mentioned one of them, the Mankind Project. Amazing organization. Love what they do. They host retreats. They host men's groups, virtual and in person. They have a variety of resources, and they're one of the largest out there. They're not for profit. Their approach to men's work is still somewhat based in this like idea of ritualism and, again, the mythopoetic Robert Bly, Iron John men's movement. And they do talk a lot about these things called masculine archetypes that can describe seasons of life that you might go through. And they don't directly state that any season or any archetype is lesser than the other, just that they're different and there might be different qualities. Now, if you're maybe like a very, system and categorically oriented thinker, this might appeal to you, because it might make you feel really comfortable to know that, the king phase of masculinity and that archetype is going to be more applicable to you when you get a little older and maybe you have a family, but it's okay to be in your warrior or maybe your prince stage earlier in life. There's other men's work organizations that rely a little bit more on indigenous teachings and wisdom, and they'll delve a little bit into the mythopoetic stuff, but for the most part, they're really based in spirituality. And I call a lot of and sometimes they'll take from, more initiation rituals. They'll use words like initiation. An example of this type of organization might be the Sacred Sons. And they have some more fundamental beliefs around masculine, feminine polarity. The idea that there are energies, and this is taken from ancient texts, but it's interpreted in such a way today that there's a masculine energy, which is like logical and grounded and firm. And then there's a feminine energy that is soft and free flowing and creative. And it's all about finding the balance between the two. And many men are stuck in their feminine energy and need more masculine energy. And the way that you cultivate that is in doing things with other men. Or many women are stuck in their masculine because there are not enough masculine men. And so that's why modern women are so career oriented. What they're really looking for is a man to step up and be in their masculine, so that women can step into their soft femininity, which is what women really crave, is being able to let go and be soft. And this messaging really resonates with a lot of people. But I believe that this messaging is a little too binary, a little too black and white. And I call this like new age spirituality, kind of like new age patriarchy, because it's implying men are like this, women are like this. And if you're doing manhood right, then it'll look like this. And that's the masculine energy. And And they find there's a lot of contradictions in this type of men's work too, because they will say, no, 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 femininity, the fierce, divine feminine is also fierce and strong, right? They're a warrior, they're amazing. And I'm like, oh, but is it the same? But I thought masculine was the strong, grounded. No, no, no. But that's like fierce like a typhoon, and this is fierce like this. And so I find there to be a little bit of contradictions. And I also feel that it rubs up against the reality of what you and I know, is that there are so many amazing women in the world that are ambitious and career oriented and accomplishing things. And they're not waiting. They're not begging for someone to come in and allow them to turn their brains off. They love their lives. This type of framework, though, is one of the most popular, and it resonates most. They have the most social media traction. And it's because, in my opinion, it is the most closely aligned with the patriarchal script that we all already know, right? So if I can repackage for you and say, hey, man, you just need to find the energetic balance and unlock your divine masculine, that sounds different than saying men don't cry and real men are big and strong, but it kind of has the same result. What happens on their men's retreats and men's groups, there are a lot of embodiment exercises and eye gazing, and this is for Mankind Project too, but in Sacred Sons is vulnerability, embracing, normalizing physical touch, a lot of great stuff, a lot of catharsis, a lot of release, somatic healing, which means bodily experiences. But they also do like ritual combat. They'll have guys get in the center of a big group, put on boxing gloves, and either wrestle each other or hit each other. They'll have kind of rituals where you are supposed to push through a bunch of other men that are trying to push you down and kind of bring you back into this feeling of maybe subjugation or victimization that an abusive father or like to represent goals. And this can be very cathartic to push against a bunch of group of men and then finally make your way through. So I think that this type of men's work would be good for men who are looking for that, or looking for this very, hey, I want to shadow box. I'm not, the type of man I want to be, or what manhood means to me is like, I want to tackle and mud wrestle and I'll feel stronger and liberated and more confident. Like, do whatever works for you. And then there's other types of men's organizations that I think Hey Brother Co. finds a really great balance, where we are informed by feminism. We practice building emotional skills. We are data driven. And the way that we design our curriculum is based on, science and what we know men are really struggling with. And we, in our retreats, we do, eye gazing exercises, vulnerability exercises. We talk about nervous system regulation, but we also showcase some really practical like documentaries. What's plaguing men? What is the suicide rate? What's going on? And so it's much less in the spiritual, ephemeral. And I would say I bias, but I think our men's work is like great for most men. But there are some men who are not ready and it's really uncomfortable, and they don't really associate with some of the stuff that we do. So there are a lot of different flavors of men's work out there. It's very important to note that men's work is not therapy. Men's work can be therapeutic and cathartic, but it is not mental health care. And there is seldom mental health care practitioners present. There are some therapists, such as yourself, who also do men's work and maybe lead men's groups, but men's work is not therapy. In my experience, men's work is an amazing complement to mental health care. So while I have been in individual therapy, going to trauma therapy, doing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy with my therapist, and really tackling, doing integrated family systems and EMDR therapy, a lot of these things to heal my trauma in that sense, it has also been amazing to lead and attend men's groups to heal that more societal wound of like, there are no good men around, like who can I rely on, and practice being vulnerable with other men, building these brotherhood relationships. That's been so healing. And so they've really complemented one another nicely. But it's important to note that it's not mental health care. It's also important to note that there are a lot of men who are more resistant to going to therapy than they would be to going to a men's group. And so men's work can be a really great gateway to start being vulnerable, start doing some of these really important things and learning breath work and nervous system regulation. And then there's going to be maybe some other guys in there that'll be like, yeah, dude, I'm in therapy. You should try it out. And that can be really great. And so hopefully that was a good summary, but I'll just say that I recommend it. Men's work has saved my life. And so whatever flavor, try a couple groups and see what works if it's available to you. And I will say it's very powerful to still do men's work virtually. There's an inside joke at Hey Brother Co. with my other leadership team. They call me like the Annie Oakley of making men cry, because I never miss, because even in virtual settings, I am able to create an energetic precedent across a Zoom room that makes men cry for the first time in years, and feel vulnerable and express. And so don't discount it. I understand that in-person friendships and connections are amazing, and that's the ultimate goal, and you will make those. But try virtual men's work if that's what's most available to you, because it saved my life, and I think it can really help every man.
Totally, man. Yeah, no, that was, I feel like we could just, the ultimate guide to men's work right there. Like you gave such a good overview of some of the main movements, the main approaches, the main types of guys that would maybe be drawn to those. And then the work that you're doing, which is this, let's say, like new wave evolving of learning how to take those more traditional and stereotypical archetypes and movements and adapting it to, I think, where the everyday average guy nowadays is and needs. But I think the message I'm taking away there is that any sort of involvement in men's work is a good first step. It's certainly not a last step. And as you take the steps, I think what you're getting at is like, know yourself and figure out like, where do I land? What in this do I really appreciate and resonate with? What do I not? What do I need more? And it might not be like you starting like a whole movement, but I think similar to what you did essentially is just like find the path that's right for you and create that. So on that note, I think it's a beautiful place to end, and I thank you for sharing your experience and your path, and making this type of views of masculinity and development accessible through your work that's so anchored in your story, and certainly doesn't end there, and will continue to impact many other men's stories. So we'll put your website in the show notes, and yeah, thank you again, Johnny.
Thank you so much, Wes. It's been an honor, and you're an incredible interviewer. Thanks for making this such an easy conversation.
Thank you, brother.